You're listening to Curiosity Invited with David Bryan here on LA Talk Radio.
Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with a gentleman who has been on the program. When he was on the program before, we were speaking about his fiction, primarily the then soon to be released When Her Hand Moves. He has written The Celeste Experiment, Catfish and Caitlin. It's really his nonfiction works are so prolific and a delight. He is also a serious scholar of the Middle East, Syria, and Muslim religion. And today, quite specifically, we're speaking about a new publication, a new book he wrote called Divine Pronouns. In it, he presents a way of understanding the Quran. It is a scientifically and methodically produced understanding of how to read the Quran, specifically focusing on the voice, the pronouns used. It's fascinating. I don't pretend to understand all of it, but he does. And so I'm really looking forward to this. I've always found my conversations with him interesting, and I hope you will as well. And now, Omar Emadi. If you have seen this podcast before, you may have seen my previous conversation I had with the other fellow on the screen right now, Omar Emadi. He tells me I don't have to call him Dr. Emadi, and you can look in the show notes for his pedigree and his prolific production of work, both fiction and nonfiction, and it really is splendid and impressive. One of those people who makes you ask that question, what exactly have I been doing?
I ask myself that question all the time.
Well, I know what you've been doing, and we're here specifically, although the conversation might surprise us and take us all sorts of places, but specifically we're here to speak about a book that Omar just wrote, published in 2024, Divine Pronouns, which you correct me anytime I say anything that's stupid or wrong, but it is a different approach, a novel approach, I believe, a novel approach to understanding the Quran. You are a Muslim. You have been all your life, right? As a child.
Right. Well, so my mother's American. She's from
Yes.
Palisades, New York, and she grew up in a Presbyterian family. And my father is a Muslim from Damascus. And in the way we grew up, we weren't quite raised, in a very specific dogmatic manner, so to speak. It was more it was a spiritual culture, but somehow it was more aligned, I would say, with Islam. We would still celebrate, Christmas and Easter and things of this type. But at the same time, I think it's because my mom was more conceptually at peace with the way in which God, specifically just this idea, not necessarily everything else, is understood in Islam. Somehow it resonated with her more. So I would say the balance was a bit more shifted towards a Muslim home. You describe it in these terms. Yes.
And I want to frame this correctly, right? So I might be using terminology, but you are a believer. You are a spiritual person, and so the point of this book and the point of your work is not to dismiss the Quran, not to diminish its importance and its significance. Kind of quite the opposite, as I understand it.
Right. Well, this is you are correct, but there's several complicating factors to this. I do identify myself as a Muslim. That is true, but the way in which I understand this identity would be one that I would find the vast majority of Muslims I meet and encounter and discussions with to disagree with the way in which I understand it. So it puts you in this kind of place where on one hand you identify, but at the same time, you're acutely aware of the fact that the way in which you understand this does not correspond with the traditional, let's say, but not even so much traditional. Even you can go outside of that. I would still feel a bit lonely in terms of how I understand this particular identity. Yes. So there is that, right? Well, what the critical difference would be is that I don't understand Islam from a religious perspective. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that we have correct religions and incorrect religions, and religions that are somehow, the adherents are saved or others are not. It doesn't make sense to me that the secret behind 100 billion known galaxies operates this way. I think what the way in which I understand Islam is more of a state of mind, a state of heart that can be found in people who've never heard of Islam. So Islam as a word, in essence, mean to align your will, your own personal choice, with that of, the will of the secret of this universe, who we refer to as God. And anyone who does this in whatever way, whether or not they've actually heard of what have come to be this religion we call Islam, is irrelevant. If you do this, in my mind, in the way I see it, you're already a Muslim in that abstract state. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that makes far more sense to me. There's billions out there that are not Muslims. Muslims are about 20-25%, depending on the statistics you look for. I think it's really fascinating that no religion really today is over 50%. I think it's almost purposeful that we are varied and different, and we approach this from various angles. But I think what really matters is something deeper than the ritual, the scripture that you may follow, the prophets or that you may identify with. I think what would make sense to me for what we call God to be looking at is a state of heart, a state of mind, something far deeper that can be found regardless of, whether you're in Alaska or Sri Lanka or the Arabian Peninsula. You can find people who are like this regardless. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So can we pivot a little bit to this book? And one of the most fascinating things about it is that it's after all of the years of people poring themselves over the text of the Quran, no one has spoken of this before. The pronouns used, the voice,
right? Not in this specific way. Yes.
So
yes.
So could you talk about why this book came about?
This story is 40 years old, because when I was 18, it was the first time that I actually ever read the Quran in its entirety, in, of course, the Arabic language. I came across, I recall clearly, several verses that felt very uncomfortable to me, whether, they were talking about interaction with women or various forms of punishments, or even passing references to what we would call slaves in essence, or slavery.
Yeah.
And so gender, violence, slavery. Some verses would really resonate. On the other hand, I would feel like they would really speak to me on a very deep level. Were it not for those verses, I would have just closed the book and moved on.
Goodbye.
Right. But so I was really confused. I didn't know what to do with these verses. And I recall my sister at the time was more like a spiritual reference to me. So she's 9 years older, and that was the first thing that I did is reach out to my sister and ask her to help me understand this. But what she couldn't answer was a question that played with my head the most, which, why would they be there in the first place? Why are they there? Why they're so uncomfortable? And I would mostly focus on my sister's approach, the approach of, these have a context. The Quran, appeared on the scene in the 7th century. It was a very different context, very different types of dynamics involved. But then you see, the problem is the moment you do this, some Muslims who don't like this approach, that's exactly their response. They say, you can't pick and choose. You do not have the authority to pick and choose. It's all there. You either accept it in its totality or leave it alone. But you can't say, well, this verse is context-based. And even if it looks as though it's truly interacting with a specific context, but you don't have that authority to do this. So, it further complicated the story for me. Even as I would find myself in conversation where I'm actually defending some of these verses, I would find that my internal battle and struggle would only intensify. And there's no clearer example of this than the famous amongst Muslim circles, verse 434, chapter 434, which appears on the surface at least to basically invest in husbands the authority to discipline their wives if they fear that they're committing adultery or something to this effect. But of course, in our world today, and to many young Muslims, especially young female Muslims, this verse becomes almost, it ends the conversation. If this verse is there, in essence, you're telling me that my husband is invested by God with the right to discipline me, regardless of the reason that may be at work, then, I don't want any of this. For the first time, and now new polls have showed this and studies that Muslims are experiencing a very similar phenomenon, possibly even a more rapid phenomenon, and the heartland of Islam.
You mean moving away from the religion, moving away from the church.
Away from religion, either identify themselves as atheists or simply not religious or not interested. And when you find, for example, there's a phenomenon of conversion to Islam in the West, but the numbers are canceled out by those who leave. Mm-hmm. So it's quite remarkable, really. You find that the Quran is often cited as one of the reasons why people leave, is because of their discomfort with various verses within the Quran. Most probably the same verses I had trouble with when I was 18. No. And the fact that they're always presented with this equation, you do not have the authority to pick and choose. You accept all of it or you leave all of it.
And is that the I was about to say standard, but is that a common response by members of the church? Is it's not God's job to make you happy. It's your job to do, that God makes the rules. So if you don't like it, well, maybe you just don't like it, but too bad. Is that usually the traditional?
Yeah, it's more emphatic than that, because, for example, the Bible is mostly understood as, by most Christians and Jews, as more the inspired word of God, right? So here with the Quran, it gets more complicated because it's almost the understanding that it's revealed through an angel, but in essence directly to the prophet. So there's a lot of talk about this being the very word of God.
Yes.
When you really study it, the in-depth scholarship, that's not quite what they're saying, but it is understood that way by the vast majority of Muslims, the direct word of God, and therefore, who are you, and what right do you have to dismiss a verse because it's uncomfortable?
It makes you uncomfortable. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what you really end up in the end is that you simply become irrelevant. I think and I think Muslims are increasingly realizing the speed with which they become spiritually irrelevant, because their sensibility, or the sensibility that they are sharing with others, is so at odds with so many things you and I, for example, we would take so much for granted, human worth, things we would understand as cruel and unusual punishments.
Right.
Obviously, understandings of human equality and things of this type. So, if you're going to advance a different discourse, you quickly risk simply becoming irrelevant. I mean, the conversation ends. It used to be that people would engage in the conversation. I increasingly find that people, many Muslims, are not even willing to talk about this anymore, because to them, the subject is closed. So it's against this background that this book was written.
Did you do the research that resulted in this book quite specifically to address what you just spoke about?
No, I to be honest, I was speaking to Omar. I wasn't really focused on what others. I never imagined that I would actually. I didn't think I would reach anything, let alone share it with others. This was really me and me. I write, as you know, I write novels, and at times I write poetry, and that's where most of my energy goes. But you know how I have like several screens on my computer, and one of them is the Quran in a Word document, right? So it's Quran is about 74,000 words. It's like you might say a large, a medium novel, really. Yeah. And there's around 6,236 verses, and I would just find myself just like almost when I would reach a point where I can't write the story anymore, or the scene gets blocked, or I just need to get my mind off of it, I just go back to that document and just scroll. I didn't even know, David, really what I was looking for. It's almost like an old story that won't leave me alone, and in my mind, it was almost a sad story, because there was a sense of grieving in sense, because like I said, there are verses that truly speak to me but I also, there are verses in the Gospels that really speak to me as well, in a deep way. So it's not exclusive to the Quran, but the Quran is part of that, and so that I think stayed with me, and I think unconsciously I kept trying to figure out a way to approach these uncomfortable verses.
Yeah.
So this is really that first is the background. This is the modality. The modality is a document that I keep scrolling through, not knowing really what I'm looking for, and just over and over, reach the end, and then go back to the beginning, just until something. I realized something was going on. Now, you see, like you said, very, very accurately, everything has been written about the Quran. How could you, thousands, if not millions of works have been written about the Quran over the last 1,400 years. So the idea that you're going to find something that someone has not addressed is the possibility is next to nothing. It is almost impossible. So, and what I initially noticed wasn't something I wasn't aware of, but suddenly I saw it almost like someone turned on a light, and I saw it in a different way. And what I'm talking about is that in the Quran, verses can either be shared in reference to God, as though someone is speaking about God, and right. So, for example, the first verses that most Muslims believe were shared with the Prophet begin like this: recite in the name of your Lord. So here, someone is speaking about God. This is not recite. This is not reciting my name.
Right.
Right?
God's not speaking. Someone's speaking about God.
Well, so it would seem, right?
Right.
So recite in the name of your Lord, your gracious Lord, your Lord who has created the human being, and it keeps going, right? And only 19 verses later do we suddenly encounter a verse that says, no, if this person who was doing a lot of harm does not stop, we shall seize him by the forelock. So that's the first introduction of a direct voice. It's not someone speaking about God. Now here, the we pronoun shows up. So this is the way the Quran is throughout. Many verses, God is being spoken about. And when God is being spoken about in Arabic language, the he pronoun is used, right? So he's being spoken out as a masculine, in the masculine pronoun, right? The absent, the third person, he's right.
Third person masculine.
Third person masculine.
Sure.
And then you would at times suddenly encounter a verse in the singular I. If my servants ask you about me, tell them I am close. I respond to those who call upon me. So here's I singular, right? These are some other verses. And then you have verses in the we, right? We offered the trust to the heavens and the earth, and they all shied away from it, but the human being accepted to take it on. Something to this effect.
Yeah.
So the we, right? So I was like, wait, why don't I separate these verses? It's a long task, but I've been doing this for a long time. I might as well try this. Why don't I put all the verses in the he pronoun in one document, verses in the I and verses in the we, and look whether or not there's something different about them. And that was the beginning. And it took on I suddenly actually started, I stopped writing my novel because it overwhelmed me insofar as I never really imagined it would go anywhere, because I've tried so many other things prior to this, different. But this seemed from the very beginning to have a promise of something. I wasn't quite sure what. So out of these 6,236 verses, it turns out that 1,268 verses are either in the we or in the I pronoun, right? So around 20% of the Quran is in direct speech. 80% is in the, you might even say the omniscient narrator, the he, masculine third person, right? So 20%. Okay. And of this 20%,
wait, 20. So 20% is in the first person, either singular or plural.
Yes.
And all of the remaining verses are in the third person?
Are in the third person. Yes. So 80%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, let's look at these. What is there something different about them? Of these, so if you take the 20 and you treat it as a unit, 90% of it is in the we pronoun, and only 10% of that 20% is in the singular I.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. So I started looking at this. Immediately, David, what becomes very clear is that, you see, these uncomfortable verses that I was speaking about earlier are almost predominantly, they involve laws.
Let's just be clear that we're talking about the uncomfortable verses, the verses that disturb your modern sensibilities.
Right.
Right.
And they are almost in invariably commands. They're commands related to marriage, divorce, punishments, treatment of at the time you might call servants or even slaves, things of this type. So they're predominantly commands. And when I started looking at this, what became eventually clear to me is that all these commands are in the third, person, masculine pronoun. Every time you come across a command of this type, it's never direct speech.
It's never
always,
I or we.
It's never I or we. It's never I or we. It's always, and I was like, that can't possibly be, because we're talking about 6,236 verses, and the verses I'm talking about, the 1,268, are scattered all over the place. They're not found in a chapter.
They're not.
They're not. I mean, you might go 10 verses and find one. You put it aside. Then you go 20. You might find 3. They're all over the place. And it's not that the we and the I don't have commands. There are commands in verses that are either in the we or in the I pronoun. There are commands.
Yeah.
It's not like the commands disappear. They do exist, but they're very different than the commands that are found in the he pronoun, right?
Different in what way?
Different on the level of all, again, verses that we would find in our world today to be, to be blunt, archaic, not at tune with where we have reached in terms of how we understand laws and relationships between, human beings and relationships between men and women. All of these, all such are almost, deliberately in the he pronoun. My first impulse was that this can't be true. There has to be an exception, because how would this have worked? There needs to be a verse about marriage or divorce that is uncomfortable in the we pronoun or in the I pronoun. And I went through this maybe 9 months, and not exaggerating, because I felt like I must have missed something. So I was reading more carefully. I was reading every verse, looking for what I have missed that would disprove this.
Right.
I was almost certain it would be disproven, because what are the chances? I mean, how would this? I still don't really know how to explain this in terms of. It's almost like you have 2 books. You bring a book, you fragment it, and then you sprinkle it within an existing book. Something like this. I don't really know. I mean, it's
well, Can I barge in with the question?
Please.
I don't want to derail us, but
no, please go ahead.
I don't know a lot about this, but the Western Bibles, right? I mean the Bible,
Yes,
Christian, Jewish, that has a long history of editing.
yes,
Right, and is that the same? Is that true also of the Quran, or has there been an effort to not allow as much as one can, right? To not allow changes based on human, I mean, like we all know, like there's the St. John's Bible, there's blah blah blah, right? There's a bunch of different versions of the Christian Bible. Is that true for the Quran or not? So I guess I'm teasing. I'm trying to ask about the he verses, the third person verses.
yes.
Were they changed dramatically over the years by human interaction, or so are you seeing something that is, well, 1,400 years. So is seeing something that is ancient-ish, or have these been doctored over and over by the human mind, trying to either make them more or less palatable to to us, to the reader?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question, and I think in fairness to our audience, it's important to understand the different historical experience of the Quran vis-a-vis what we might call the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and there are some very important differences there, in the sense that primarily the Quran is in its original language, right? It's in the Arabic language. It's not. Christ most probably spoke Aramaic or a dialect thereof, and the earliest manuscripts we have, fragments, New Testament, are in Greek. Later on, they're translated, and we have a Latin Bible, and then later on we start having it translated into various other European languages.
And then the Vatican gets involved, and
right. With the Hebrew Bible, they do actually have very old manuscripts in Hebrew that, for the most part, correspond with the existing Hebrew Bible. So that's a bit different. With the Quran, we have lots of manuscripts. They're not the totality of the Quran. About 45% in some cases, in some other cases, possibly more, that are carbon tested to go back to the exact 7th century Arabian Peninsula. In some cases, written or on skins of animal that could have possibly even been alive during the Prophet's life, or possibly even a bit earlier. It's quite safe to say, from a scholar perspective, that this is what really was. Now, there are variations, because initially it was written in a script that allowed some words to be vocalized in different ways. And these variations are, they exist. There are about 7, but they don't play with the meaning of words in any significant ways.
I see.
So it's more or less. I mean, the deeper you go, obviously you would bring up some certain nuances and stuff. But it's more or less what was there at the 7th century, I would say, and this explains the passion with which Muslims, hold on to it, because to them, they're not even holding on to a translation. They're holding on to something, that they believe, was divinely inspired from the very beginning. And there it is. And that complicates things. It's easier to deal with an English translation of, New Testament, because, as you said, you can change words, you can do various things.
Take out a whole chunk of it, then put in a whole chunk of it. Yes.
Right. But this you can't touch. And because you can't touch, what do? And if you were to come up and say, well, this verse is clearly context oriented, you don't have that, again, you go back to the authority issue. Right. But the thing that I have come across, this is not Omar saying, I don't like this verse. This is from within the text. This is almost a code within the text that allows you to differentiate between various verses based on something which happens to be really interesting to us and almost in fashion today, which is the use of pronouns. Almost God is is speaking through various pronouns, and in so doing is highlighting which type of content is more timeless than other, or more universal than other types of content. When you hear me being spoken about,
yes,
context, right? When I speak in the singular I, proximity and intimacy, and when I speak in the we, this is where it's almost these are like signifiers to you're attempting to capture something, obviously, that is over and above language, right? What is God after all? I mean, it's something. It's way above, and so these various pronouns are almost attempted to capture something that by its very nature can't be captured. Yes.
Let me just say, I don't want to just gloss over it. That's astonishing, right? I mean, that pattern I'm assuming it's true. I trust you.
Yes, yes. I still think one day I'll wake up and come across a verse that contradicts this. But I honestly I did everything I can to disprove it.
So the pages stuck together. You missed those, right? No. So that's, I mean, it's an amazing pattern. And so there are these two groups, one much larger than the other. I'm assuming the I and we verses, the first person verses, do not contain any of the, for lack of a better term, disturbing commands.
Right. They contain, there are 15 commands that they actually contain.
Yes. Right.
They speak about kindness to parents,
Yes.
kindness to children, and not, respecting the faith of others, responding to people's harm with grace,
Right.
giving, not just financial, not just charity in a financial sense, but, of your time, of what you might possess to others.
Enduring principles of goodwill and generosity.
Yes.
Is it the case that all of the third person verses, it's not the case that all of the third person verses contain commands that are disturbing?
No.
If
When you find one,
when you find a disturbing
it's in the
verse,
Hebrew now.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's remarkable. Right?
Yes,
Remarkable.
and it's especially remarkable, David, when you think that even understanding God in terms of he, right, of this, that the use of the pronoun is consistent with that, patriarchal, culture of the 7th century Arabia. Even the use of the pronoun is relatable and more accessible, obviously, to the predominant forces that are at work in those cultures. And so even in the way in which God is being referred to, we seems to be far more accessible. I mean, we is mysterious, is complex, even as it emphasizes its singularity, and which it does. It's nevertheless, it points to, the complexity of whatever this is that is behind all of this, that is, at work, that is with us, that is part of us. Yes.
What do you make of this? And what has been the response of, of others who are, I guarantee, far more knowledgeable than me when it comes to the Quran, right? I mean, there's people who pour themselves and have poured themselves over the Quran for years. So
Right.
What do they make of this? And what do you make of this pattern?
Right. Well, on a pure personal level, I think, like I said, I've been perplexed and disturbed for 40 years, ever since I read the Quran in its entirety. And I finally have come across, I never thought I would actually would arrive at this point, but I found a way to see it, to explain why some verses resonate with me so deeply, and to see the verses that are uncomfortable to me as almost coded in a manner that allows me to put them aside, and not disrespectfully, but
not to ignore them, but to look for something deeper, perhaps look for an
yes,
underlying
to see that there's, when the divine interacts with a specific context, as my sister explained to me ages ago. But in addition now to her explanation, I have a code that puts it all in a okay, I see it now, it makes sense. Yes. Insofar as how others have interacted with this, you have the whole spectrum. I taught a class recently, and it had some young Muslim women and men, and then some of them come from very strong religious backgrounds. Some of them felt instantly almost like relieved, like they've been battling with this silently, because a lot of this is almost taboo to talk about, especially if you live in a religious Muslim family and things of this type. It was almost like relieved, like, okay, I don't need to explain why a verse like this would have been included. I get it. It's coded in a color almost that in fact, some proposed to me that we should have a Quran that is color coded, so that when the we is colored by a certain highlight, like let's say green, I yellow, he I don't know, gray, something like this. Yeah, and then it lends itself to being experienced in a completely different way. So we've had that. I've had the antithesis, which is, how dare you touch the Quran in this manner? These shifts are nothing but eloquence. God is extremely eloquent, and therefore shifts pronouns, and it has no other. It's a literary device. It's not to be understood.
They simply dismiss it like that. They're not really going to dig in.
Yeah, and I'm putting it nicely. I mean, the dismissal was a bit harsh, and I mean, I expected it to a certain extent, because you're almost, it's so precious in their minds and in their hearts.
Well, fundamentalism of all sorts. When people hold so tightly that they're not willing to. Right. I mean, that appears in all sorts of different places, right? Not just about the Quran, but almost everything. It's not done that way. It's simply the response. It's like, yes, but why? So give me, other than that's not what we do, give me another explanation. And there isn't any. It's more just, people hold more tightly rather than, oh, that's interesting. Let's think about that.
And then I had, I guess my, a reaction that was reminiscent of my own, which is, that can't be true. You must have missed a verse. And I confess that sometimes, as I'm taking my shower in the morning, I was like, did I miss a verse? Because it's, again, think about it. It's 74,000 words. So many commands, hundreds of commands, how would it be that they always shift like that? But we would go through the exercise together, and they would think of a verse that they remember, and they would go back and they would find, and this most ironic aspect of it is that sometimes you'd have the verse like immediately followed by, so they're attached together and yet they're separate by pronoun. Yes.
Yeah. It's.
I guess I want to emphasize, just in case your audience misunderstands. I'm not. I'm not trying here to present the Quran as miraculous or as somehow having a miraculous nature. I'm not. This is not. If this is what is being heard, I'm being misunderstood. This was really about something that I was personally struggling with. I don't have an explanation for why it is like this, but it gives me a sense of peace, and that's really where there is no deeper point here that I don't know how it was done. True, but it must have an historic explanation. I'm not.
What do you want to be the result of? If you could snap your fingers and magically make whatever, what would you want the result of this insight? Let's assume you didn't miss a verse, right?
Right.
What would you want it to be?
Right. Well, one would think that I would want a lot of, so many Muslims with whom I feel any type of, relationship in terms of how they see the world and how they, this almost cosmic battle and the way they understand various things taking place. I don't think this book will make any difference. Because I don't think they act this way because of the Quran. They actually read the Quran because they're looking for something that just, if they weren't Muslim, they could be something. They want an ideology that would frame their actions, and they happen to find it in Islam. So I don't think this would make any difference to people like this, or of this sensibility. But what I do want is for people who happen to be Muslim, who are having this faith crisis, right? Who are suffering in silence, who truly feel like there's these obstacles that are obstructing their capacity to grow spiritually, to be at peace with who they are and what they are. I want to take off these burdens. I want to. It's almost like a brick on their shoulders, and I want to remove it. And if this book helps in this, and even in a minimal sense, I would be extremely. I feel like I did more than I even expected. Yes.
Do you have a hunch about why? I mean, many people feel that way, right? I mean, not just with Islam, but and yet it's a hard leap to go for many people to go from being at odds with one's spiritual roots to then go towards atheism,
right?
Well, maybe it's all a bunch of baloney, right? I mean, and maybe it's a relic of the past that provided something for human culture, human beings, individually, groups, and that it's a relic of the past that we don't need anymore. Right, that it's just like the appendix, right? At some point, it helped because of the foods we consumed, but now it's just left over.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I wonder, and this has nothing to do. This may have nothing to do with our conversation, but did you ever wrestle with that yourself? Sort of, why? Well, maybe you. It seems to me, as the way you described it, you hold your religion lightly and gently. You're not clutching it, desperately clutching it, but rather sort of letting it rest lightly in your hands, as a way of asking deeper questions and sort of seeing deeper mysteries. And I just, I wonder about that. Have you ever wrestled with, well, why am I still so focused on this?
Right. Right. Well, I think that's an excellent question. I really often found, and this might sound strange, that some of the atheists that I speak to, I think I encounter in their sensibility and the way in which they describe their journey, a very deep experience of faith. I think it is often the case that they describe themselves as atheists precisely because what they visualize as God, or what we refer to as God, it can't be reconciled with the way in which God is being shared with them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost as though they're saying, it has to be much greater than what you're describing, and in the process, I'm rejecting this entire discourse, right? So in this sense, I think that rather than seeing lack of faith, I see sometimes a very intense experience of faith. Almost, adamant that it has to be relatable. It has to be reconcilable by, you know, our own sensibility. And if all you're going to talk about is floods and God speaking from over mountains and things of, you know, references and symbolism that seems so,
Right.
you know, almost unrelatable, almost like fables and things of this type. If that's how you understand this, then I don't believe it.
Yeah.
Then I'm not. I guess the difference between my experience and is that I'm more stubborn. I'm going to make it relatable. I'm going to rephrase it, research it, redescribe it until it fits, right?
Well, that's what's so striking about this for me. It does not, as I read the book, it does not, and I don't pretend to understand all of it, obviously, but it does not read as I'm going to reinterpret this because I'm trying to convince you of something. It feels like, I mean, in some ways, it's a very academic and very scientific approach, right? I mean, it's really basic science. Like, I'm taking this text and I am analyzing it in terms of, you know, which column does it go in?
Yes.
And here's what I've seen. Here's what I've seen. Tell me I'm wrong, right? I mean, it's almost like the periodical table of elements, right? It's like there are these properties of certain substances, and geez, if you put them in those columns, it makes some sense. It makes sense. And so it doesn't read as if somebody's trying to twist meaning out of something that feels strained. It really does feel like, hey, take a look at this because it's super interesting.
Yes.
Yes. So it's.
Well, I'm glad you read it that way. I think it's partially your gracious eyes that saw it this way, but I hope most people will see it that way as well. I'm not the only. If there is a point, it's simply that I was able to find a way to personally, remove my own burden. And I hope this will help those who might relate to this experience.
Yeah. Well, it certainly opened my eyes and has made me more intrigued than I was before about that whole territory of the world. So is there anything else you would like to say before we close up? Not because I'm tired of this conversation, but because I know people's ears they fall off after a little while.
Yes. Well, I'm possibly only that I find myself in this strange position where I'm actually talking about a work which is in essence falls under the larger heading of spirituality or possibly even Quranic studies or something of this type. I'm more familiar with the Omar who simply wants to write a story and share it and hope that others will find it interesting and interact with that. So having finished this book, I am now heavily engaged in writing a novel, and it's almost to a certain extent a recovery process because I want to go back to where I feel I fit more closely, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yes,
I understand. Well, Omar, I just want to say thank you once again for being willing to give up your time and
absolutely. Thank you so much, David, and for this beautiful opportunity. Honestly,
yeah, ditto.
You're listening to Curiosity Invited with David Bryan here on LA Talk Radio.